The Theory of Flight by Siphiwe Ndlovu. Themes. So within this video, I'll be dealing with three main themes, that being belonging, connection, and freedom. And with it, I will also add some important quotes that relate to those themes, and that will be in quotation marks highlighted in yellow. So firstly, when dealing with connection, we see that it is made clear in the beginning that the story of what happened to Jeannie is also the story of many other characters, and that the novel switches the point of view between characters, time and place, which reveals the connection through these interwoven stories. And a quote that adds to this, or two quotes that I've broken up from one quote to make it easier to remember, is that it did not happen in a vacuum, or it was the result of a culmination of events. So when looking at the connection through relatives, we see that this deals with the genealogy of the story. And this is prevalent with Golide's actions when he shoots down the Vickers Viscount, obviously for parts for his plane. Not only did it affect his followers, but more importantly, it changed his daughter's life. So that's when we see that him and Elizabeth go missing, and she ends up having to be adopted by the Masukas because she's chased out of Beaufort. Then we also see that this is how Vida decided to become a street dweller, because of his line of descent, the fact that his parents had both died, and his lover at the time, which was Everly. And this also then allows him to help save Jeannie later on in the story, which wouldn't have happened if he hadn't taken to the streets, because he wouldn't have been there in that time. Then the next one is the connection through events, which also still links to the previous connections. And this deals with the teleology of the story, the purpose. So we see that Jeannie's accident, which was when Cookie hit her with the car, occurred because of previous events, and this was the catalyst for Jeannie and Vida's relationship, as it leads her to want to do something good with her life and save Vida, because Vida had saved her. This accident also puts a strain on Crystal and Jeannie's relationship, as we see that they start to drift because Crystal believes that she is the reason for Jeannie being in that accident, with the whole situation of Jeannie running back on the road to go fetch Crystal, and this causes Crystal to blame herself continuously and almost pull away from Jeannie, because she believes that is where Jeannie got HIV from. It also leads to Jeannie leaving the Masukus and losing contact with them, as she starts to realize what she wants to do with her life. The next sub-connection is connection through truths, which deals with the epistemology, and we see that not all beliefs are objectively true, yet they are true to the relevant character. So basically what this means is that each character believes their own truths, and to them that is what makes sense and that is what is true. But if we look at it as the story as a whole, there are many other elements that have actually contributed towards that truth, and hence the one truth that that character believes might not be the full story. So we see that Crystal believes that she is the bad guy in their family and in the story in general, that no one's acknowledging that she is the reason for Jeannie's death per se, because of her getting HIV from a blood transfusion, but she also believes that Marcus is then always portrayed in this role as the hero with hope. We see that Esme believes her relationship with Marcus will end when Jeannie dies, as Marcus belongs to her only during the day, and she is worried that he will just conceal everything and retreat into the night to be with Jeannie, which from his perspective he believes that that is not the case. Then we also see that Dr. Mumbo thinks that the something good that Jeannie has done with her life is that she had found someone to love and someone to love her, which could be seen differently from other people's perspectives. And then we also see that both Dingane and Becky Timber, who aren't directly related to each other in any way in the novel, but rather indirectly, are both convinced that they are responsible for what happened on the Beaufort farm and estate in 1987, which is when the Sojas attacked. But looking at the story as a whole, they both contributed towards this. And we see that the last thing is that Valentine believes that Mordecai and Menelcle's torturer are completely two different people, but we know that they are the same person. So that just summarizes that whole idea of not all beliefs being objectively true. And then looking at the connection through moments, which deals with the epidemiology, we understand that this is usually the study of diseases, but the narrator dives deeper into it by describing it as ways of dying. And we see that it refers to Jeannie's HIV positive diagnosis as it affects her relationship with Vida. And we see that because of this status, he looks after her with everything that he can, and in turn, she fought everything that HIV had put in her path. And what also adds to this is that Jeannie knows that her death is inevitable, but she's still determined to choose her own ending. And after she passes, the living connection that Vida had with her is severed, but we also see that Marcus questions if they ever really had a connection. The next major theme is belonging, and the novel deals with this as wanting to feel connected to certain things, such as land or people, and it also shows belonging by contrasting it with the feeling of alienation, which is evident with Vida, who deals with race and sexuality. First, we're going to look at belonging through love. Marcus struggled to find a sense of belonging within his own family, and rather found it in the form of a colourful woman who carried a baby on her back and sang songs of love. Moreover, Marcus had never felt such a deep sense of belonging as he did with Elizabeth and Golide. What we can understand is that Marcus felt most at home, and he felt like he belonged when he was on Beaufort with Jeannie, Elizabeth, and Golide. We also see that Jeannie and Vida understood and loved one another, and Vida understood that he must never speak to her of love, because for them that is what worked. When he eventually tells her that he loves her, she responds with, "You remind me of rivers I swam in long time ago. You are home." Which for Jeannie is stronger than love, because home creates a sense of belonging for her, which she only felt with her parents and with Vida throughout her life. Next, we're going to deal with belonging through family. When Marcus thinks of home, he thinks of Jeannie on the Beaufort farm and estate. At the end of the novel, he wonders about the meaning of belonging, because he always thought that he belonged to Jeannie, but wonders if it was rather something that he felt, rather than it actually being something that was tangible. Standing at her funeral with his wife and family, he then realizes that this is where he belongs. The being with his family is the actual truth for him. And Jeannie did not belong in the Masuku's facade, as she was genuine, and the Masukas were like a glass menagerie, beautiful to look at, but always a breath away from shattering. Jeannie always felt belonging with her mother and instantly with her father, as seen when she runs up to him without actually knowing who he is when he first comes back to Beaufort. Looking at belonging through acceptance, Vida found belonging in being accepted as he struggled with his sexuality. We see that his first love, Everly, had this understanding of who he was, about him being bisexual, because for him he could understand that he was gay, but he struggled to accept that he was bi. And Everly understood this and accepted him for this, and his father also accepted him for this, which created a sense of belonging for Vida. Vida also found it difficult to accept the house that Jack built, which was left for him. It was linked to race as a result of colonial zoning laws, and we see that his grandfather loved the house, but his father left it as soon as he could, although both his father and grandfather lived in the house as slaves. And this whole concept conflicted Vida, whether he should be proud of the house or whether he should be ashamed or embarrassed of it. And he was worried that he'd always be disappointing either his father or grandfather, regardless of what decision he made, whether to stay in the house or whether to sell the house. So instead we see that he had done nothing to the house with the house until he moved into it with Jeannie. We see that this is resolved when he meets Jeannie, who accepts him and allows him to accept himself in order to make that tough decision of moving into the house. And we see that Jeannie did not feel belonging with the Masukus due to their lack of acceptance of her, as I mentioned earlier. But we see this lack of acceptance clearly through Eunice, as she saw Jeannie as a disappointment and never accepted her from the beginning. Dingani and Tandi were never really parents to her, and we see this as she never calls them mom or dad. Dingani also only adopted her out of guilt and not because he wanted her per se. And also we see the lack of acceptance when Marcus lets go of her hand and Crystal accepts her and loves her for being inferior but not for who she is. Therefore Crystal never truly accepted Jeannie for who she is. And the last theme is freedom, or main theme with the novel. And we see that Jeannie and Vida find freedom by not talking about love and by knowing each other's truths. They had no choice but to accept each other. It was liberation. The liberation and the freedom of living on the streets also brought the freedom from obligation for the street dwellers, and specifically Vida. And we also see, which is quite major and can also be dealt as a theme of its own, is that the idea of a free country is also tackled as the novel changes from colonial to post-colonial times, and whether the country truly gained independence or not. So we see this when looking at the colonial government versus the man himself, and how the organization has retained that corruption and becomes indistinguishable from the previous government in terms of power abuse. We see this kind of conflict also when Vida is not seen as white enough during the colonial times within the country, but then his statues are taken down, or his sculptures are taken down, because he is seen as too white to be a true post-colonial artist in the post-colonial time of the novel. And then lastly, we see that freedom is an illusion that can only truly be found on a deeper personal level, and we see this through the changes that Becky Timber has throughout the novel, going from believing that colonial times were better, following in his grandpa's footsteps, to making that decision for himself that independence is what is better when being inspired by Bob Marley's singing. But then at the same time, he comes to the realization that not much has changed, and that those in power will always abuse that power, and he has now fallen into that trap by having to report the stories that only the man himself wants him to report. We also see that the choices made by characters allow for liberation, like when Jeannie chooses her own ending, when she decides to die and stop taking her medication, or when Eunice reports her husband as wanting to overthrow the government to Emil Kutsia in order to physically gain freedom from this abusive man who did not want her to study and did not want to help her at all. So like I said, these are just the main themes. There are many other themes within the novel, but these are to have a better understanding of the main ideas of the novel.